behind. When all the world seems in tune, and love goes on softly home. So don't be sighing or crying, dear, if winter comes.
All right, welcome to another Lawyers, Guns, and Money podcast. Because everyone else at my blog is a slacker, this one will again be about Game of Thrones. I'm Scott R. Kaufman, SEK, with Stephen Attewell, who, well, everyone, we should all be well acquainted by now. I'm going to let Stephen take the floor, in part because my comments are going to seem totally juvenile, and I want you to sort of listen to what he says first and think we're both smart before you turn the podcast off and don't hear what I say. So, all right, go on.
So, there's a lot going on in this episode. Rather than go chronologically, I thought we'd sort of group it around three questions that the episode seems to be posing. One of which is this question of what does loyalty mean? One of which is the what are the necessities of power? And finally, what does it mean to have religious faith when you live in a world with literal miracles happening in front of you? So, starting with the question of loyalty, we have I noticed there are probably more kind of interesting cases of characters having to choose which side they're on and choose what loyalty means to them. And we can start with Jon Snow having to choose which loyalty he's going to side with. Is he going to be loyal to the Night's Watch and deceive his new friends? Or is he going to tell the truth and potentially doom the Night's Watch? And he actually does a bit of both. He tells them the truth about which castles are manned, but he lies about how many men they have. And then
he only tells them the truth because he knows that Mackenzie Wark has actually seen which castles are manned, and so he's sort of forced. I mean, Wark forced his hand into revealing which castles were actually manned. The only thing that he could lie about was how many men were there. Right. And
then he's sort of forced into another moment of truth, if you will. The question of will he break his vows with Ygritte in the cave? And
yes,
okay.
yes, he will.
Yes, he will.
Yeah.
I missed.
Sorry, Professor. I was just.
Yeah. I kind of missed the line in the books where he said, I broke my vows that night, and then twice again in the morning, which is just like a great, Catskills kind of line. But as much as they're sleeping together is portrayed as a romantic, moment between two people, it also has this underlying theme of loyalty where she says, you swore vows, I want you to break them. And then afterwards he says, I was a man of the Night's Watch. And then Ygritte kind of makes a slight betrayal of her own in that she says, let's never leave this cave. It's not that she's turning her back and saying, I want to join the Night's Watch, but rather she's sort of saying, why don't we pick a third option and just stay out of this war?
But it's also, it's just a gesture on her part. I mean, all she's really saying is, I would like you to know that I would be willing to stay here with you forever. Granted, they both know that that's completely unrealistic and will never happen, but as a gesture, it's a big thing for someone like Jon Snow. And I guess one of the visual elements I will bring up is that before they get into the cave, the camera really and the director, Alex Graves, really starts focusing on Jon Snow's face in these close-ups that we really haven't seen from him since he and Sam parted ways. It was the kind of conversational close-up that we saw a lot with him and Sam, where it was trying to establish the fact that Jon Snow is who you think he is. He is this loyal friend to someone who is being beaten down by others, and he is more than his code. He also has this other moral order that he is attached to, and we have not seen that sort of close up on him in quite a while. And all of a sudden, right before he and Ygritte run off to the cave, we're just right up there in Jon Snow's face, about 3 inches away from it, and the camera's telling us you and Mr. Snow are intimate relations. You know him very well. You trust him in everything he does and everything he will do. And now why don't you just go make love in the cave? But it's a really interesting kind of dynamic, because they're trying to reinforce something that we think is sort of obvious. We're supposed to be sympathetic with Jon Snow. But on the other hand, they're trying to reinforce our sympathy and our trust in him at the very moment he's betraying the other half of the moral code that he officially adopted. It's interesting. I think a lot of people just are going to miss it because they're like, oh, Jon Snow, you know.
Yeah, and the shipping kind of takes over for a lot of people. Likewise with this next scene where, you know, Jaime reflecting on the meaning of loyalty in the baths, where after some really creepy bits with Roose Bolton and Qyburn, who, you know, in their own ways are shown to be strange and not particularly trustworthy people, that Bolton is very friendly, suspiciously friendly, but then does the patented Bolton mindfuck on Jaime.
The Bolton mindfuck, oh yeah.
Yeah, and then Qyburn, like, did you look at that guy's eyes when he was, like, getting to, you know, operate on somebody without anesthetic? He was so happy.
You know, he's waited his whole life. He doesn't have any chains. It's not like he can't go that direction. He's just happy to be able to. I mean, he's sort of like a grad student who's been asked about his dissertation for the first time. He's just like, oh yeah, you want to hear about that? Wow, I spent 8 years writing it and no one's ever read it. So yeah, let's go. But yeah, if we're gonna talk about the bath scene, well, I'll let you talk about it first, since.
Okay, sure. So I mean, you know, there's both sort of physical and metaphorical nakedness, in that Jaime is very much kind of peeling back all of these layers of defensiveness and pride, and telling the truth about what he did when he killed the Kingslayer. When he killed the Mad King. And, you know, he poses an interesting question, which is, at the end of the day, which is the more honorable thing? Is it to be loyal to a Mad King who wants to kill everyone in the capital, or is it to murder a tyrant? And, you know, he poses an interesting question as he's kind of falling unconscious. Who has the right to judge? Can the wolf judge the lion? So what do you think of this?
Well, because my focus is on visuals, I thought it was all about asses. And I say that in a sort of juvenile way, but the way it's set up visually is actually really interesting. And the scene begins with what seems to be Jaime pressing, for lack of a better word, himself upon Brienne. He walks up knowing he's naked.
He gets in her space.
Yes. But it's not her space. And in fact, the way that Alex Graves sets it up, it's a diamond on screen, and she occupies the uppermost quadrant of it. And Jaime he sort of slinks into the lowermost. And if we want to talk about how shots are framed, the person who seems to be in the top end of the screen seems to have a dominant position over the person who especially when they sort of slink the way Jaime does, into the bottom quadrant. And it's really
That's interesting because, you know, Brienne looks incredibly uncomfortable.
And
initially.
She absolutely is. And she's uncomfortable in part because Jaime is, in a way, sharing his nakedness with her. They're both now flawed or imperfect knights. It would be one way to put it. She's imperfect, obviously, because she's a woman, and women cannot be real knights. He's now imperfect because he's lost his hand, and we get this really strongly.
Oh yeah, I mean they really show the stump.
Yeah,
incredibly straightforwardly in this scene.
Let me read something I wrote on my little notebook that has nothing to do with this. Brienne's ass and Jaime's stump. Yes. That prolonged scene where she actually obscures his head initially, and so it's literally her ass and his stump. And these are the two things that make them. It's a split second before they cut to what's essentially a medium-long shot of Jaime with his stump, with Brienne's ass out of focus in the foreground. But it's really important because it's the first time we've seen, and by seen I mean seen visually, Brienne is a woman, right? Her proportions are female. They want us to know that Brienne is a woman.
And Jaime reacts to her that way, for the first
actually,
time.
He doesn't at first,
well,
though.
Except that he feels shame when she stands up as if to sort of dare him to be like, okay, take a look. He's like, I shouldn't have done that.
Except he doesn't do that initially. While she's speaking, after she stands up, he maintains eye contact with her. And if I can, I'll grab the episode, do post-production stuff, and show the frame. But he actually maintains eye contact with her for a good 20 seconds. And only after he's established her humanity and their shared humanity does his eyes sort of wander down. And then he's ashamed. But what's interesting is that he wasn't at first. That at first when she stood up, he didn't see it as a woman that he wanted to fuck. He saw it as a person whose eyes he needed to meet. And I think that's really important because we're building a lot more quickly than we did in the novels the relationship between Jaime and Brienne. Like, that their relationship is based on mutual respect.
Well, I mean, except that this scene was almost, I mean, of the scenes in this episode, was probably the most faithful to the show. To the original source material. The only major difference is that the line at the very end of the scene where he says, Jaime, my name is Jaime, where there's kind of an interesting sub-theme of identity also running through this episode, is that in the book he's thinking that as he's falling unconscious, and here he actually gets to vocalize to Brienne, someone who for a long time he's only referred to with insults. But
this is a real, I think it's a really well done moment of I mean, they're both stripped naked, and they've without actually talking about what they're talking about, they've come to an agreement here. They have decided to do something. I mean, Brienne actually catching him as he falls it's almost a signature on the conspiracy into which they've entered, and it's really well done. And Jaime's shame at actually having looked at Brienne as a woman, as opposed to a co-conspirator, is, I think, a great moment. I mean, it's but it's all set up by the asses. I mean, it's I sort of hate to focus on that, but in part because in my class yesterday we were talking about pornography and the use of it on the show, and my students are just going to think I'm a pervert, but really I think this is another really brilliant use of pornography to discomfit viewers in a way that pushes the narrative forward in an interesting fashion.
I mean, I would say that they used nudity in this episode in a way that is much better than in that kind of infamous Littlefinger monologue scene from season 1. In that, pretty much every use of nudity had something to do with either character or plot. It was either about characters showing themselves to other characters, or it was about the use of sex as a tool, as opposed to it just being sort of visual background.
Well, so, I don't think it was visual background in that earlier scene. I think it's really significant that he was talking about his childhood sweetheart while also directing lesbians as to how to have sex. I think you're supposed to hold those two things.
I think that's stretching a little bit, but
well, no, I know, I really do. I think in terms of intending to titillate an audience, right? If you're going to have two women having sex being directed by a man who is making one of them into a man via his directions, what they really want to do is make us think about what kind of a person would be directing basically a pornographic film behind him while talking about the first kiss he ever had when he was 9 years old or 6 years old. Like, holding those two thoughts in tension at the same time is creepy. And like I tell my students, if that scene is actually titillating, please talk about it with your therapist, because you have issues.
Okay. So getting back to the theme of loyalty, just because I want to kind of wrap this up, and because we have so much to get to, my God, there's an interesting moment where Gendry chooses the Brotherhood, and there's this kind of tension between two families and the question of class between them. I really like that scene. It really tugs at your heartstrings when Maisie Williams says, I could be your family. That was just like, oh.
Well, it's in part because of all of the characters so far, and no pun intended, but Arya is the most unsullied. She's the one who we identify with.
That's a
still the most.
Thought.
She's made a couple of decisions, but has had other people. Wait, actually, I'm just going to rewind that and say, no, actually, she actually has been a bit like Joffrey up to this point, having other people do her dirty work.
Well,
and
she
that's
killed
kept her
that
hands
one
clean.
stable boy.
Yeah, well, she killed the stable boy, but
yeah, the showrunners have actually talked about this, that by this point in the books, Arya has killed maybe a dozen men.
Yeah,
maybe more, and had a significant impact in the world of Westeros by doing so. Whereas they've decided, what they basically said was they didn't feel that would be plausible for her to go from 0 to 60. That she needed an emotional ramp up. And I thought that this half of the season we're seeing that emotional ramp up, where slowly she is losing this invented family that she created. And
which invented family? The one she prays about every night, or
she's clinging to that one, but she's losing Hot Pie, she's losing Gendry, she lost last season, she lost Yoren, and so forth, and now she's arguably in this episode she's kind of lost faith with justice a little bit, and it's going to be interesting to see how they do her character arc in the second half of the season.
Well, I think one thing that they know they can do with Arya is, well, basically anything. I mean, she's in terms of our identification with her, she is sort of impregnable. Like, we will identify with Arya. She is the continually wronged party. And again, in my class, like when I actually ask my students about characters, Arya's character is, you can't really, there's nothing to say about her that could be negative. Even the negative things are not negative because she has a motivation for them. Mm-hmm. And she's just beloved. And in this episode, I think they tried to make her a little more unlikable. She's sort of rash in the way they cut from a long shot of someone to a close-up of her hand on someone else's sword, and then another long shot.
It's a breaking point, and the moment where she screams, "Burn in hell," is like, she's had it at this point. She just cannot take injustice anymore. But we can. I want to get back to that when we talk about faith. The final sort of theme of loyalty is the scene with Grey Worm talking with Dany at the same time that Barristan talks with Jorah, and it's kind of two interesting parallel conversations. On the one hand, this kind of interesting political volleying back and forth that starts out very friendly and then ends with, a line being very firmly drawn that these two guys are not going to be friends. And on the other hand, that their conversation is entirely about loyalty and, wanting to serve someone who is actually worthy of service. And then on the other hand, we have this scene with Grey Worm where, he pledges, symbolically is pledging himself to Dany, but in a way that kind of, she has like almost a tiny, what's the musical term when you go back to a theme that you've introduced already? It's a word I'm blanking on.
Returning to a theme. I think you explained it perfectly well.
All right, we return to a theme of like the big speech of Dany the Liberator. Where she's telling them, pick a name, one that you feel is honorable and worthy and dignified. And then she kind of gets thrown back on her heels a little bit when Grey Worm kind of shows that the slaves have their own definition of the world around them. That to him, this demeaning name, Grey Worm, now is a name that has, luck and honor associated because it's the name he was freed under.
Because it's almost as if they're people and not just pawn in her giant political play for what I mean. Yeah, it's a nice moment, and what I like most about it is that she acknowledges it.
Yeah.
And that's something that, I mean, clearly white people in America haven't done even to this day when they make fun of black people for sticking an X after their name. It's, oh, yes.
Oh, yeah.
You're all still very concerned about the slavery thing. That ended a long time ago. Economic repercussions, whatever, what the fuck, it's done. But, yeah, it's a really great moment for her because she gets to actually be, for once, a sort of hands-off leader in a way, like, because everything else she's tried to do has been very much intended to establish her leadership, right? I will hold the dragon on the chain, I will order the dragon to burn you alive.
Right.
And now she's actually allowing her subjects more agency than she attributed them earlier. Yeah. I guess would be one way to say it.
Which I think makes a good transition to the theme about the necessities of power. Where, I think we should start with this, compared to my rant last week, here I think Robb Stark's plotline really started to click. Where we've got, Karstark and his rage and vengeance boiling over into open rebellion, and the central dilemma of feudal leadership. I saw a lot of the fan reaction was like, oh, here's Robb, acting, doing the stupid Ned Stark thing of choosing justice over the smart thing to do. But in reality, as much as his three advisors are telling him to hold Karstark as hostage, he's kind of in a bind. There isn't a good way out for him because in a feudal system, you have two diametrically opposing truths. One truth is that at the end of the day, your power is the people who follow you. And that's true all the way up and down the line. So, when Karstark becomes your enemy, unfortunately that means all of his men, whose loyalty has been directed to you through him, now become your enemy. So, if you kill him, you lose all of that power structure. But on the other hand, it also means that power is personal. And, you only have as much power as people put in your person. So if Robb were to allow Karstark to openly defy him in this way, then he'd lose potentially the whole of his army, and not just half of it. So there isn't a good way out.
Well, no, there isn't a good way out, and also because and you were talking last week about the sort of relationship of host and guest, and part of the idea of the way hostages are treated in Game of Thrones is based on the host-guest relationship.
Yeah, the guest right.
Yeah, and it's been violated under Robb's watch.
Yes.
He doesn't have a choice. What's really interesting about his scene with Karstark is the way it develops visually in terms of it begins with Robb and his wife in a 2-shot, and then Robb, his wife, and his mother in a 3-shot, and then Robb, his wife, and Karstark and his mother in a 4-shot, which means all 4 of them are in the shot. And so we have this sort of expansion initially that more people are having say in what's going on, and then about halfway through the scene, it reverses, and we get Robb and his wife and his mother in a 3-shot, Robb and his wife and Karstark in a 3-shot, Robb and his wife in a 3-shot, and then we focus in on Robb in a medium close-up, and then a close-up for the remainder of the scene. So as he makes his decision, he's actually being alienated visually. So what's going on in terms of him taking a stand and putting the weight on his shoulders is being reflected visually in the fact that we're moving from shots with multiple people to shots with just Robb, just his face, so we can identify with him as he makes the decision. And it's actually really similar to what happened in the first episode, as you were alluding to, with Ned and the execution of Will, which is that in the end, we had a close-up on Ned, cut to a sort of medium shot of him and the sword cutting off Will's head, and then back to a close-up of Ned. Yes, it was eerily familiar. It also had certain, I don't know if it had direct shot for shot, but it also reminded me very much of the Theon execution of Roderick Cassel. No, it didn't correspond to that. It corresponded
maybe
directly.
Not shot for shot, but it's both executions happen in the rain. They're of a defiant older man, as opposed to a penitent young man.
About themes. I'm talking about do you not realize I'm OCD?
I get that. It's interesting because it's like him and Theon take the Ned test.
Yeah.
And Robb pulls it off, and Theon doesn't. And one thing I just want to for people who are curious about what Karstark was doing, he's calling down curses upon Robb. But in addition to the whole guest right thing, there is also the issue of kinslaying. I just wanted to point out there that Karstark is kind of bullshitting at this moment. It is not true that killing as remote a relative as Karstark is kinslaying. If that was the case, you couldn't fight wars in Westeros, because all of the nobles are, that distantly related to one another. So, but, he's got this level of anger in him that it's almost cosmic, that he just wants to pull down as much as he can, because at the end of the day, nothing was going to fill up the hole that was left.
And it is significant that anger wasn't, for the most part, aimed at Robb. It was aimed at Cat, who is not actually kin. Right, yeah. Or is only kin by marriage, not by blood, the way that Robb would be. But yeah, no, I do think that's important, that we have another example of someone trying to use these sort of personal connections, and as you were saying, we have the two kinds of powers being manipulated, and this is a last-ditch attempt by Karstark to not get executed.
I don't think that's even that. I think at that point he knows he's going to die. I think it's a last-ditch attempt at revenge on a new target, that he's going to make Robb suffer for doing this as much as he can.
Actually, and this is weird, but I thought he sort of passively aggressively forced Robb's hand into murdering the Watchman, the guy who wasn't.
Oh yes, that was a great line. The bit about he only watched, so hang him last so he could watch the others go.
I mean, it's almost as if Karstark was trying to say, "Look, Robb, you're a bit of a sociopath." That's actually the point at which Robb ceased to be like Ned, because that's something that, in terms of character development, we never would have seen from Ned. You know,
I disagree. I think that's exactly the kind of thing that Ned would have done, because, you know, at the end of the day, it goes back to this thing of, you know, the man who passes the sentence should swing the sword, and with these guys, you know, he's making an argument that witness is just as equally complicity as murder. That this guy.
Well, but I mean that gets us back to like the last episode of Seinfeld and the application of the Good Samaritan Act. Like,
sure.
Should he have? Well, yeah, he probably should have said something. There were two little boys being murdered. But
this is slightly different. He wasn't just there as a bystander who saw this happen. He was like the getaway driver watching a shootout take place. You know, he was a Karstark man who walked into Robb's dungeon
to do something. Yeah, he was just following orders. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, you know.
All right. The Jew relents. The Jew relents. He was just following orders. Yes.
The other Jew wins. So, you know, and it's also kind of interesting that after he makes this decision, after like 4 episodes of not being able to make up his mind about what he's doing, Robb actually hits on a strategic plan that makes sense. And this was the Robb Stark that I'd been missing for 4 episodes. That he's gonna take Casterly Rock as a political means of resetting the scales of power. That, you know, he's lost Winterfell. That's a huge blow to his standing. If he can take Casterly Rock, that's an equally big blow to Tywin Lannister. And then the question becomes not so much is his tiny dwindling army doomed in the face of the Tyrell Lannister alliance, but is there anything left of the Lannister Tyrell alliance if the if the Lannisters can't hold up their end and provide the gold, while the Tyrells provide the food? And that nicely segues us into our next, you know, all the machinations in King's Landing. So what did you think of this kind of interesting, almost like telephone game of conversations, starting with Tyrion and Olenna and then ending with Tywin and his children?
Well, first I'll just say that the conversation between Tyrion and Olenna was really disappointing, because I expected something that was more evenly matched, and Tyrion, he just got schooled. And
Olenna was also disappointed.
Yeah, I mean, he got, and I think it's one of the few times we've seen in the series when Tyrion has actually underestimated someone in a significant way. He assumed that he was dealing with someone like his sister, who was manipulating people behind the scenes, but didn't have any actual knowledge of what these machinations entail. So
I don't know if he actually underestimated her, but keep going.
Well, I mean, the way the scene played out, and the way the camera kept on getting higher and higher on Tyrion and lower and lower on her, it was, you know, because the high level of framing or angle of framing is going to make someone look smaller, and the low is going to make them look more important. They really seem to be pressing the fact that Tyrion, you know, he brought a knife to a gunfight.
Yes, no, I definitely agree with that. I just think the issue is that he didn't have any bullets to fire to keep pushing the metaphor, and he knew it, I think, from the outset.
Well, also, he had a knife, and it's really difficult to fire bullets out of a knife. But you know,
unless you have one of those gun knives from Final Fantasy.
But yeah, I think he was overmatched and underprepared, and it's one of the few times we've seen him not fully prepared for what he's about to encounter. And
although he does get what he wants in the end. I mean, that's the kind of the weird thing, is that Olenna...
Not by the end of the episode.
No, but in this scene, like, Olenna bests him completely, but almost as a consolation prize,
it's not almost. It's absolute consolation
gives him
prize.
the practical thing that he wants.
It's also a it's a humiliation. I mean, she's actually telling him, "I'm giving you a consolation prize. Nice try. Maybe next time."
Yeah, and I did think it was interesting, you know, from the political side, that we see some of the different ideology of the two houses at work. That with Tyrion, it's very much about the war effort, and power comes from your ability to finance a war. And Lady Olenna, by contrast, is really saying it's about bread and circuses too. That at the end of the day, you can't fight a war if you can't inspire anyone to follow you. And the reality is that, you know, 9/10 of the people fighting this war are small folk, and small folk like bread and circuses. And so we're going to get...
Small folk's probably not the word you want to use there, but yeah, I know what you mean.
Well, it's the word that I sell Team Small Folk t-shirts.
Small folk, not little people, is what we're saying. It's
they're not the highborn.
Yeah.
They are the small folk.
But what's actually really interesting about that is it's a nice inversion of the logic in Blackwater, where Tyrion was very much about the bread. He was very much about performance. It was performance in the effort to lead the war, but it was totally performative, right? When he stood atop the wall and got the troops behind him, he was very much concerned about appearance then. Mm-hmm. And, you know, even now he's more concerned about
paying for everything.
Yeah. It just, you know, counting money, and it shows I think a little bit how the office is wearing down on him. Exactly. All right, and that's exactly where I was going. We're seeing the diminishment of, and I just didn't want to really like say, hey, look, the little person is being made smaller, but yeah, he really is. Go on, sorry.
So that kind of nicely, I mean, that scene sort of sets up the kind of symbolic price that the Tyrells are trying to eke out of all of this, which is that Marjorie is making a play for Sansa, and Sansa seems very happy to make this play, and in fact, you know, when Littlefinger comes to her after having been primed by Cersei, she makes a choice, and she says, I'm going to go with the Tyrells, not with you. And this is the second time that Sansa has had an offer of escape and has turned it down in favor of a different option. But it's also it's a different kind of political offer at work, that Marjorie is saying, I'm going to gather enough influence that I can make you the Lady of Highgarden. And it's the Tyrell ways to build alliances, not to tear them down. And we see that, you know, Cersei can't really grok that at all. And that, you know, her immediate go-to is to say, you know, these people who are funding the war effort and who are keeping us alive, they must be our enemies, and we must do something about it.
Well, Cersei at this point is, and we've got this the past 2 episodes, she's simply confused. She no longer knows what game she's playing. And obviously we get that at the very end of this episode. You know, the last lines of this episode indicate that Cersei doesn't, she thought herself a queen, and she turned out to be a pawn.
The daughter of Tywin Lannister.
Yeah, and
question of identity again.
Yeah, I mean, the irony that she's always used that as a weapon, and yet it's what's limiting her now. Although I think we should talk about Tyrion's upcoming nuptials, because that, you know, on the one hand, that scene is interesting to me because it recapitulates the one 2 episodes ago in which, you know, the Lannisters sat around the table and chose their positions. Tyrion is in the exact position he chose. He drug that chair there. He put it there.
And he's staying there.
Cersei isn't. She's actually on the other side of the table, but
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting, you know, in this scene where Tywin is laying down new identities for his children, as a means of, and this is a very characteristic Tywin thing, of turning an attack into a riposte against the attacker. That, you know, the Tyrells are threatening to take the North, and he's going to respond by essentially binding the Tyrells and the Lannisters even closer together. That Tyrion refuses to give up his position of analysis, that he says, this is wrong. This is morally wrong to do this to Sansa. And you know, when Tywin says, you know, you're going to do this, and he says, hey, don't you remember, I was already married, you know, and he showed a lot more sort of spine than Cersei does. Cersei almost reverts back to childhood and says, Daddy, please don't do this.
Yeah, she doesn't say don't do this. She says don't do this again.
Again, yes.
And that's a very important again. And Tyrion doesn't say that. He takes a moral position that is sort of unrelated to himself. Don't do this to Sansa.
Yes.
That's his appeal. Cersei's appeal is don't do this to me again. Right. She's appealing to her father as her father, not strategically in the way that Tyrion is, because we don't want to give Tyrion too much credit and make him seem altruistic, and because he's Tyrion. I mean, don't trust him, people who haven't already read the book.
And I think it's going to be really interesting to see how the showrunners and the audience will handle Tyrion's marriage to Sansa, because historically this has been a very divisive topic in the fandom, because you have two characters who are loved by different demographics within the fandom, coming to, you know, through no fault of either of their own, coming to a very personal crisis. And
it's really odd that you say that she's beloved. I mean, this is actually the moment where she becomes palatable, if only barely, with her marriage to. At least that's my experience in novels.
Well, I'm just, you know, looking around the fandom, I would say there is a large segment who are very defensive towards Sansa's character, and who see the rampant dislike of her, especially from book one, as, you know, ultimately stemming from misogyny. And
I think they have other issues. It's not misogyny. It's the sort of distaste for white privilege, and I mean the reasons that we don't have to be misogynist to dislike someone like Sansa, and I don't think most of my students who dislike her are in fact being misogynist. I think they're just they know that girl. They went to school with her. Sure. They know her, and they know that it's a function of a privilege that they don't have.
Sure.
And that she's not aware that she has until it gets taken away. I mean, I don't think Sansa's at all sympathetic until the moment that her father's head's being cut off.
Yeah, except that I would say that, you know, Arya in her own way has just as much privilege. It's just that she
has it, but she also recognizes that.
Well, I mean, you know, but at the same time, she's expressing it through a more masculinized idiom than Sansa does. But in a way, both of them believe in stories up until this moment of disillusionment at the end of book one. I'm not particularly taking a side here. I'm just saying, you know, you have people.
Take a side, damn it! Take a side.
All right, I will say that I think that Sansa in book one is very much a deconstruction of the medievalist trend within fantasy and within romance more generally. That
all of my medievalist friends, feel free to attack Stephen for that very shortly.
Go ahead. I'm pretty sure I'm right about it.
I don't know. She's she's almost not even a character. I mean, she is at least in the first book and in the first season, whereas Arya, when she, and I guess another way to put this would be to just to simply ask if you had, who would be Sansa's role model versus who would be Arya's? For Sansa, we could posit a number of answers, that there are people who could be Sansa's role model. She is becoming a type, right? She's moving towards a stereotype. Arya is not.
Well, I mean,
Arya's moving into uncharted territory. I mean, I think, and that's why I think my students who are, and for those of you who don't know, I teach at UCI, which is 54% Asian or Asian American, and therefore they tend to sympathize with people who aren't part of the upper class. But they latch on to Arya because she is a character they can associate with, that she is marginalized. There is no role model for her to emulate. She can't, right? And she moves from role model to role model, all of whom are men, but they're men of suspect sexuality. I mean, beginning, right, with Syrio and then moving forward, right? We don't even know if Jon Snow is still a man. He could change his face and he could be a woman, right? And I think that's a significant difference between her and Sansa. And it's partly why Sansa. Okay, go on. Sorry.
I've always said that, one of the sort of the interesting things about, people's love of Arya and then what happens to her in the series is that Arya is going through a very well-recognized character arc. She's basically Batman.
Nah, goddammit, yes, she is, of course. She thinks both her parents are dead. Yes.
And she goes through a series of tutors. She's at, a secret temple of, face-changing ninja assassins. It's all there. But the thing is, the psychological impact of all of this is deeply not empowering to her. She's not becoming someone, she's losing someone.
And that's the old thing with that. Yes, I was clapped.
What I find interesting is that the fandom celebrates Arya's more conventional aspects within genre, but doesn't quite see the deconstruction going on within the character.
Okay, but the thing is that Batman doesn't exist in this genre.
Right, but it's also, it could be
it's a martial
Skywalker.
Arts.
It could be.
It's not. Okay, there's a big difference. Luke Skywalker was born to lead, right? That's the difference between. We want to be careful to differentiate between people who, have both of the king's bodies and who were born into royalty and their royal blood outs, and people like Arya or Bruce Wayne, for whom circumstance is what drives them to greatness. Because, right, otherwise you have...
Well, I mean, but at the same time, she is a Stark, and she is one of two Starks...
Who look like her dad.
Who look like their dad, and who have the wolf blood in them. Right, who have this, ancient heritage of the North and all of its mystical traditions with it. I just think I think there is more, there is that kind of, hero's journey stuff to happening to Arya.
So what you're saying is the show is un-American. It's all about bloodlines, and you hate America. Admit it.
Well, it's not about America. It's about a feudal world, and as historians have been unfortunately talking about since ever since the 1950s, America didn't have a feudal period. We love princesses, but we don't get the concept of nobility, really.
Well, we don't. Okay, and I will jump in here and say, we don't get the concept of nobility, and yet we keep trying to elect Kennedys. And if Hillary had won the nomination in 2008, and
we don't understand nobility, we understand dynasties.
Yeah, we would have gone Clinton, Bush,
so
Clinton, Yeah, but
I've got about like 10 more minutes before I have to run off. So I just want to talk about this question of faith. So, the interesting thing is, Thoros and Beric and the Brotherhood believe completely that the Lord of Light will show the truth in this trial. And that in some ways it's a very typical medieval belief about trial by combat, but it's also in the case all of them are privy to something that that the Hound, Gendry, and Arya
it's a
aren't privy
rigged
to.
game. Yeah, they all know that.
Yeah, that
Bunch of carnies.
their God is real, and they know that because they've seen miracles. But the interesting thing is, at the same time, they have a certain, I would say, kind of, at least Thoros and Beric have a certain kind of maturity about what the meaning of their faith in the face of reality is. That Thoros says, well, I'm a drunk. He doesn't react in the way that Melisandre does. He doesn't see himself as a great prophet and, beloved of the god. He says, I'm a drunk, and God just chooses to work through me. And, Beric can see on his body the cost of this divinity, and he sees that there's a cost to it. Which is completely contrasted to Selyse Baratheon, Stannis' wife, who is so devout, so fanatic, that she's completely rejected the normal idioms of her family to say monogamy and marriage, to say no act in the service of God is a sin. So there's an interesting difference within the Church of R'hllor.